There we go. Now we're getting started. All right, well, welcome to our virtual VUG Canada session today on architecture, design, and best practices. We welcome you. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy days to join us here. And we really hope that you enjoy this time with us and that you learn something new. All right, so just first piece of housekeeping, Chris Childerhose, who is also a VUG Canada leader, will not be able to join us, unfortunately, today. As for myself, my name is Hin Tang. I am a solutions architect for an MSP here in Toronto. I've been working with Veeam since about 2018. I started on the customer side, working with Veeam for Hyper-V. Outside of work, I really enjoy doing things outside, like skiing in the winter and summertime, paddleboarding and camping. And that's just a little bit about me. How about you, Tyler?
I'm Tyler Juergens. I'm also with a service provider here in Canada. Outside of work, I do a lot of spend a lot of time with family, and also a member of multiple different community organizations like Veeam here, as well as VMware user groups. So yeah, why don't we take it away, Hin, and let's get going.
Okay, hold on. It's not advancing. Okay, there we go. All right, so first of all, we're going to go over what we're going to cover today. And first, I'd like to do a caveat. What we're not going to cover is the Cloud Connect part, because the Veeam Cloud Connect architecture has many different considerations that we won't be covering here. We'll just be talking about the main Veeam backup and recovery, Veeam backup and replication product. We're going to go over a brief best practices for what makes a good Veeam architecture, and then we're going to transition into actually designing our first simple deployment or all-in-one Veeam architecture. From there, we're going to go and break out some of the components for a larger deployment. We're going to give you some tips and tricks on scaling this out, as well as all along the way giving you our Veeam architecture best practices.
And we will we'll absolutely entertain some questions, but please try to keep them to either end of the slide or at the end of the presentation. But we love some interaction with you guys. So if you have any questions, absolutely ask. We also ask or answer questions about Cloud Connect if you have any. But like we said, this presentation will be mostly focused around the normal Veeam backup application.
All right. So at a high level, the fundamentals of a good Veeam architecture are very similar to what you would have for any kind of system or infrastructure design. The first part is that we need to design for high availability, and this is understanding your points of failure in your design, understanding how to build redundancy into the design, and to know how to recover if any of the elements of their architecture fail. Secondly, we need to design for high performance. This is understanding where your possible bottlenecks are, understanding the limitations of your design, whether they be in disk performance, for example, or network speed, and basically going through and designing the best performance you can get for the requirements that you've been given. The third part is designing for high scalability. And this is understanding what all the components of the Veeam solution do and how to scale up each of the components. And when your service grows, which components you'll have to add or increase resources on. Also knowing how to build in more capacity or redundancy, and also knowing what additional Veeam components you'll have to add to your solution once new challenges arise. And of course, none of us are dealing with unlimited budgets, so we need to work within those constraints. Along the way, we're going to be giving a lot of the Veeam best practices, and often our budgets don't allow us to use the best practices for all of the components. So in that case, we will you'll have to make the decision to balance off your budget with the performance and actually use at least what I'd like to call the least worst practices. All right, so Tyler?
Great. So there's a few things you need to know when you're building and you're designing your Veeam environment. So one of the things you're going to want to do is get out there, do some data gathering for your environment. So you want to know what your virtual workloads are. You want to know what your physical workloads are. You want to know how much data you have and how much that data changes over time. Because having 10 terabytes today and presenting a repository with 10 terabytes is great, but if you're scaling at 1 terabyte a month, that's going to quickly be not enough. So you want to keep those factors in mind and also understand what your retention requirements are. So if you want to keep 7 years of backups, that's going to be very different storage considerations than if you want to keep 7 days of backups. You also want to know what your RTO and your RPOs are. So you want to know what your recovery time is, how fast can you get your environment back up in the event of a disaster, what your recovery point objective is. So like where in time do you want to go back to for your recovery? How much data can you afford to lose? And then as well, keep in mind what your backup window is. So when you are backing things up, understand how that may impact your production environment when you want to pause your backups, run your backups at maybe overnight, but if you have an hour RPO, that's going to impact how frequently you want to run your backup. So keep all those factors in mind when you're designing and building. And then define your SLA. So you want to go out to your business leaders, out to your business and say, hey, what SLAs do we have for our business? How fast do we need to get everything backed up? But we need to get this written down in a document so that we have our DR plan, we have our backup strategy all figured out, and ways to mitigate all possible data loss scenarios. So when you're designing for DR, you want to consider, okay, well, what happens if I lose a single host in my cluster? What happens if it's the only host I have? What happens if my whole site goes down? What happens if I have 15 sites and one site goes down? Where are your considerations as you go along with your SLAs? And then of course, design for, your 3-2-1 rule. So 3 copies of your backups, 2 different media, one of them being offsite. So these are all very good considerations when you're going in and designing your build.
All right, so thanks, Tyler. Now that we know some of the high-level concepts and gathered our information, we're ready to build our first all-in-one deployment, or what's known as a simple deployment. This is basically going to be all of the components of your VBR solution on one server. It's really good for small environments, but keep in mind, because it's one server, this is your single point of failure. So you need to understand how to recover from the loss of that server. We're going to have some calculators, which will be in the links at the end of this presentation. And that will guide you to be able to properly size all of the different components and then properly size this one server for your all-in-one deployment. A very key best practice is to never install your Veeam backup and replication server in the same domain as your production, because that will just introduce a security risk that you don't need. So let's go over the various components that will go into this all-in-one deployment. The first is your console or the main server. This is the brains of the operation. This is where you're going to be setting all of your connections to your virtualization platform and your proxies and your repositories. This must be built on a 64-bit Windows system. The recommendation obviously is to use the latest version of server that you can use. It's also supported on Windows 10 and Windows 11, but that's really recommended just for a proof of concept or a lab test environment. The next part is the configuration backup, and this is very essential because, as we said, this one server is your single point of failure, so you need to be able to recover it. So the recommendation is obviously to have it configured and to have it encrypted, and also to have at least 2 copies of it. By default, the configuration backup, when it's configured, will back up to the default repository, which is a local repository. Obviously, that's not good. If you lose your server, you lose the configuration backup. So there are options to use either third-party tools such as Robocopy to copy it to a second location. You could also change the location of the configuration backup to use a repository which is on a different server. And then when we get to the database, starting in version 12, the default is that it will install PostgreSQL locally on that machine and leverage that for the configuration backup database. If you do need to use SQL for whatever reason, you will have to install either SQL Express or SQL Standard locally on the machine, and then during the installation process, connect to that instance and install your database there. In your environment, if you happen to have already deployed a dedicated SQL or Postgres server during the installation process, you can point the database to that server and leverage whatever redundancy or high availability options have been configured on that database server. In terms of proxies, when you first install the VBR product, a general purpose proxy will be installed by default. You'll have to go in and install both either or the VMware and the Hyper-V proxy roles will have to be installed on that server itself. When it comes to the repository, because this is a Windows-based server, the recommendation is to format your repository volumes as REFS with 64K blocks. In addition, the other components that you may need to install or enable are things like the mount server or the guest interaction proxy. So that's a high-level overview of what goes into an all-in-one deployment. Now, Tyler, would you like to walk us through scaling this out?
Sure. And so the next slide here, you can see there's a nice diagram and overview here of all the different components that go into a Veeam environment. So these slides will be shared later. You can review these at whim, and these are also in the documentation, but we want to give you a nice overview of what goes into a Veeam environment here. The next here is in, thank you. And then when we want to start scaling out for a larger deployment, what are we looking at with that? So we want to look at, where do we put our VBR servers? So we can install each of these components that Hin had mentioned separately. A lot of this can be peeled off and scaled out. So in larger deployments, we'll need more components. We might need all of these to be split off. We might need only some of these to be split off. So you can scale depending on your deployment needs and your environment needs to know where and when to scale out and when to peel off these different components. Some of the great ways to do this are, taking that database server, separating that out onto a separate server. And like Hin mentioned in the previous slides, you can do a Microsoft SQL server, you can do an SQL Express, you can do a Postgres server. So I like to do Postgres. It's a great low cost or no cost way of getting a nice database server for your environment, and it's easy to split off. If you got any kind of Linux skills, you can deploy it on Linux. You can also do Postgres on Windows if you need. And then as well, the repositories are a clear win to split that off into a separate environment or a separate component. So you can have hardware repositories, maybe deploy an REFS on Windows or an XFS repository for Linux. And you can go that extra step further and get that hardened Linux repository. And then as well with Sobers, and we go over a lot of these components later in the presentation here as well. But with the Sobers, then you can go, you have one extent as part of your Sober, and if you need to scale up and get more space to handle your Veeam environment and Veeam backup needs, you can add more extents to that Sober and quickly scale that up as well.
Thanks a lot, Tyler. All right, so now let's go into a deep dive of all the different components that we can break out as we scale out this deployment. The first thing we're going to talk about is the backup server itself, or the console server. One thing to consider when you're making your design is the location of this server. If you're just running backups, you have a choice of deploying it either on the production side or on the disaster recovery or secondary site. But if you have replication or CDP replication in your design, it's highly recommended that you keep your backup server on the DR side. So in case of a disaster, you can use that server to initiate the failover. Another best practice is to make sure that you've enabled MFA or multi-factor authentication on all of the users that will be accessing this console. That just gives you another layer of protection in case someone is able to get onto that console and use one of the credentials. Another best practice is to have a good understanding of all the different roles and assign just the correct users to the specific roles. So these roles include things like your backup operator, your restore operator, your view-only backup operator, tape operators, or the big one is your backup administrators. So make sure that you understand which users are in which groups and assign them correctly. And as we all know, we get really busy. We're all doing multiple things in our work, so oftentimes we forget to log off a particular server or service that we're using. So there is a configuration, an option that you can use within Veeam to configure timeouts for all your logins, so that if you do get in a situation, if a backup administrator is on the server and forgets to log out, after that specific amount of time, they will automatically be logged off. That's another layer of security. And finally, there is an option to actually remove the console from your main server. This just helps you to be able to have a better security posture so that there's less of an attack vector on the backup server itself. And then you would spin up a separate management server in for example, in a different network segment, and then run the console from there and connect to the backup server. The other consideration is to disable the remote desktop on that server itself. That's another recommendation for security. Keep in mind that if you do remove the console from your main server, it also removes all of the explorers, and it also removes the PowerShell module. So, in your design, it's kind of going to be a decision of security versus automation or scripting. And so in the consideration, when you spin up that management server, you'll have to install the explorers as well as the console on that particular server.
And Hin, on statement one there, you mentioned that we should have that backup, that VBR server on the DR side. There's other options there. What else could we do if we, for whatever reason, we didn't have that VBR server in our DR site?
Well, then you have the option, if you've correctly configured your configuration backups, you can spin up either a warm backup server that you can bring up in case of a disaster recovery, and then you can restore the configuration from your configuration backups.
Great, thank you.
All right. So let's move on to Tyler. Tyler's going to walk us through some considerations for the database server.
Absolutely. So when you're running into databases here with Veeam, you can often get away, with your all-in-one with MS SQL Express or an on-site Postgres, bundle that into your all-in-one. But at some point, you're going to scale beyond the needs of that, and splitting off your database server into a separate, server running just the database is one of my favorite ways of scaling up Veeam, especially now that it supports Postgres. You can split that off without any real additional costs other than, maybe you're running it on a VM and you have those infrastructure costs to run an additional VM. But when you split it off, that leaves your VBR server handling VBR tasks and your Veeam in your backup database server running just the database tasks. So you can really scale up your environment quite significantly just by that one simple step. And so Postgres here, new database supported by Veeam, only supports right now VBR and Enterprise Manager, Veeam One and Veeam Service Provider Console for those service providers in the audience here. Those are still on Microsoft only. Veeam does have it, in their roadmap at some point to migrate them as well. But for now, you can still use your old trusty Microsoft database for that. And so when you're looking at your Veeam servers, you look at your DB server and consolidate the calculations. So every different Veeam component, your VBR, your Veeam, your Veeam1, they have different database requirements. So you're going to want to, if you go with a single database server to fit all your needs, you're going to want to consolidate those requirements, build that into how you size your database server properly. And then as well, there is a PowerShell tuning script for Postgres that you can run to really tune your Postgres to be the best it can be for running your Veeam database. So it's a great way to improve the scalability of that Postgres server itself when you're tying it off with your Veeam environment here.
All right.
Let's take it away here, Ken.
Thanks, Tyler. Now let's talk about proxies. The first one we're going to tackle is the VMware backup proxies. General principle, again, best practice is to plan to scale out your proxies and not scale up. And by this, we mean when you do need more proxy processing power, to spin up another proxy rather than add resources to existing proxies. One of the decisions that you'll have to make is deciding between Linux and Windows. And some of the considerations there are the Linux expertise of your team. Some companies don't have people who are very confident in managing Linux servers. In that case, they will probably decide to deploy Windows proxies. And in that case, using the Windows Core operating system is good because it doesn't require a license. So the Linux versus Windows is going to be an ongoing discussion about which one is better for your environment, and that's something that you'll have to take into consideration when you're designing this architecture. In general, though, the best practice is to deploy your VMware backup proxies as close to the source as possible. And the next question is about transport modes. And again, as this graphic says, it depends, right? You have, as we just talked about, you have the decision between Linux and Windows. In addition, you also have decisions to whether you want to deploy virtual backup proxies or physical. Each one has its advantages. Virtual proxies will allow you to use the hot add mode for transport. Physical may be better for direct SAN access or fiber channel backup from storage snapshots, for example. So these are all things that you'll have to consider as you put together your architecture to scale out these proxies. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about Hyper-V. I know that Hyper-V is a little bit like the stepchild of the virtualization world, but it's out there. It's a good solution for some companies who don't want or can't afford to deal with the VMware licensing costs. So if you have a Hyper-V environment that you are protecting, the first recommendation is to use your on-host proxy. This leverages the data processing on the nodes that are actually hosting the VM, and it is the most efficient way of backing up Hyper-V VMs. But in a situation where you have some constraints on resources, you can deploy off-host proxies. And again, the principle here is to scale out your proxies and not scale them up. You have to keep in mind that the Hyper-V role must be enabled on all of the proxies, and they must match the version of the infrastructure that you're trying to protect. And again, same principle here, deploy these off-host proxies as close to the source as you can. Okay, so next, Tyler, can you walk us through some repository considerations?
Absolutely, absolutely. So with repositories, as we kind of alluded to earlier, there's many different ways you can slice and dice your repository setup. So when you're talking about, your basic repositories, you've got maybe an old server out there that you've redeployed with, a bunch of disks that you want to install Windows on, or Linux. You can do those with your REFS repositories or your XFS repositories. If you're doing something like REFS, keep in mind there is usually a little more of a RAM recommendations there, so please double check your best practices and your sizing guides to ensure that you've got the amount of resources that you need to run these repositories. And then when it comes to sobers, now you can take, one repository, add it to a sober, even a single extent sober, and then scale out your environment that way. So once you run out of space, you add another extent. My favorite way to do sobers is 1 extent per physical server. But if you need, you can add, more disk to an existing server, add that as a backup repository and add that extent now to your sober and keep scaling out that way. Veeam is very flexible that way. It gives you a bunch of different options on what you can do. And now keep in mind that only Enterprise Plus licensing allows you to go beyond 1 sober. And usually the recommendation is keep it to about 4 extents per sober. You can go above that. There is nothing stopping you, but it's a good best practice to keep the sobers reasonably sized with the 4 extents. And then when you're talking the Linux hardened repositories, these are a great way to get immutability into your environment at relatively low cost. So you can have your Linux server formatted with XFS. You can do all this work yourself. It's not a lot of effort. I know there's many people on our call that have done that before, but Veeam now also has a ISO available that can deploy that hardened repository for you. Obviously, you need the hardware to support it, but you boot into that ISO, you install the OS, and it does all the settings necessary to get you a Veeam Linux hardened repository. So it's a great way to get that immutability into your environment at very low cost. Then you also have a bunch of different deduplication appliances. Hin in the next slide will go over those. And then you can also do cloud repositories. So this is where something like, people like Hin and I come in. We have our Cloud Connect repositories that you can talk to us about and get some extra cloud storage there. Or you can go to an S3 provider, either one of the big guys or one of the service providers. Again, like Hin and I, we all have S3 repositories that we can offer you for your offsite backups. So you can do even stuff like what Hin was mentioning, the configuration backups. You can point those to an S3 repository, a great way to keep your configurations offsite and easy to recover from in the event of a catastrophe. So Hin, why don't you elaborate a little more on deduplication appliances next?
All right, thanks, Tyler. Okay, so we're just going to do a little bit of a high-level overview of deduplication appliances. They're quite a popular option for offloading and efficiently storing your backup copies. In general, they're not recommended for your primary backup, and the main reason for that is that there's slowness in rehydrating the data when you want to do a restore. However, saying that, the vendors do say that they do support this. So if you want to use that as part of your design, that's something you'll have to consult with Veeam and the vendor to see if that's a viable option. But in general, they're used as a target for backup copies and for long-term retention. There's a list of repository and job configurations that are common to all deduplication appliances. We'll have the link to that at the end of this presentation. Just ensure that if you are going to put this in your solution, that you check all of those advanced configurations and make sure that they're all set properly. In addition, a lot of the deduplication appliances have built-in replication. So that's another recommendation. If they have that already in place, you can leverage that deduplication appliance replication to a second appliance or to a second site. It gives you another copy of all of your backup copy information in a second location. Another thing to consider is how to design your proxies and your gateways. If you have these on separate servers, you have to consider that there's a network speed that you have to put into your design. So there's a recommendation, if you can, to put the proxy and the gateways on the same server to avoid that network traffic. And finally, just an understanding of where the deduplication actually happens. Again, it's a little bit different for each vendor, But as we mentioned before, using the gateway is actually the piece from Veeam that connects to the deduplication appliance itself. It does the data moving, and just understand how the deduplication happens for your particular dedupe appliance vendor, and design your configuration, your architecture based on that. Okay, so we're also going to move on to talk about some other components that you may want to put into your Veeam architecture. The first one we've already touched on a little bit is the gateway server. And this is a component that you need for any repository that is not able to house the Veeam transport agent. So in this case, for example, SMB or file share repositories will need a gateway server, as well as deduplication appliances like Dell Data Domain or HP Store Once. And also you'll need a gateway server if you want to use object storage as your repository. Now, in terms of tape has really had a renaissance in recent years, because it really is the only true offsite air-gapped solution for your backups. And if you want to put tape into your Veeam architecture design, keep in mind that the recommendation is your tape server should have 8 cores and 32 gigabytes of memory as a minimum. And to also make sure that you look at the network speed between the different components. So between your repository and the tape server, and between the tape server and your tape library. So the third part here is that, just to let you know, that there are some enterprise plugins that you can leverage if you have any of these kind of databases, either HANA or Oracle or MS SQL. It allows you to do application level backup capabilities. You can add that into your solution, and you're able to back up these enterprise databases. And finally, there's what used to be called the file backup proxies, which have been renamed to become general purpose proxies. You'll need these if you're backing up any file shares. And again, there's going to be calculators at the end of this presentation, so please leverage those to properly size these proxies based on the amount of file shares that you'll be backing up. Okay, so I'm just going to hand it back to Tyler. He's going to give us talk a little bit about networking.
Absolutely, thank you, Hin. And so when you're talking about your networking, any networking will do, but obviously faster gets better results, right? So many of us may be rocking 400 gig networking already, but some of us will still be on the old 1 gig or 10 gig. So we recommend 10 gig or better, especially when you're talking about trying to meet those RTO and RPO guidelines. How fast can you get the data onto your repositories, your repository speed, how fast can that ingest data? And then when you're talking about restores, how fast can you restore from those repositories? They make a big impact to your RTO and RPO timings. Therefore, you want to get up to that 10 gig or faster speeds, right? If you've got some repositories on, straight NVMe flash, fancy storage repositories there, maybe you need 25 gig or 50 gig or even 100 gig. That is all going to depend on your business needs and what you need to do and how fast you need to get your backups in and how fast you need to get those restores running, okay? And then when you're talking about your network, you're going to want to segment that. You don't want your Veeam server to be sitting on the same network as all the rest of your infrastructure components. If you ever get compromised on your infrastructure, you don't want your Veeam server to be compromised as well, right? And the more segmentation, the more separation you can have on your network, on your domain, can help secure your environment even further against any of those attack vectors from getting into your Veeam. And then, like Hin mentioned, do the extra steps, get some, offsite immutable backups, get some tape storage in there. You want to do those kind of things to help secure. And then know how your components talk to each other. That's huge. So when you're talking about your Veeam, know that your Know that your backup proxies talk directly to your backup repositories. That's huge. It doesn't have to flow through your VBR, so you don't need to have, that necessarily quick action between your VBR, or that fast network between your VBR and your proxies, but you definitely need it between your proxies and your backup repositories, right? So you want to know how all those components connect in. There's definitely, we showed you a diagram earlier, a few different ways they connect. There's best practices guides. We have all those links for you, so it helps you design, and the community here is great. So reach out, ask questions. We're here to help you. And if there's a problem, it's not DNS. There's no way it's DNS. Sorry, you got me. It's always DNS. So keep those things in mind. When you're looking at your environment here, and thank you for that, Paul. So I'll pass it back here to Hin with showcase. Well, actually, we'll showcase the different links here. So there's a different best practices guides. The R&D forums are a valuable wealth of information on how to do Veeam and what other people are running into when they're talking about their Veeam problems and issues. I've learned a lot just checking the forums and reading different forum posts. I run into stuff I never thought I would run into on those posts. So the community forums, R&D forums, huge wealth of a lot of valuable information. You can end up talking to people like Hin and myself if you'd like to. And then you can also have the calculators. There's calculators there for your repository sizing. The Postgres tuning script that was asked earlier in the comments, we have that Postgres tuning script link there. These will be shared with you after. Deduplication appliance best practices. The deduplication appliances Hin mentioned above. We have a bunch of best practices around there. And then the security best practice guide as well. Definitely well worth reading through these links, getting familiar with them, getting familiar with how you want to get your Veeam environment built and designed to manage your needs.
All right. And we've come to the end of the session. We hope that it was informative for you guys. And there will be a recording of this, as we mentioned at the beginning, and we will be sharing these slides as well. So if you weren't able to do a screen capture of them, they will be available for you in a few days. So just to talk about the VUG Canada and what our plans are, we have been having virtual sessions in the last few years, but we are planning to have some in-person sessions in 2024. And again, location to be determined, content to be determined, and that's what number 2 is. We really rely on you as the community to let us know what you'd like to hear about and what you'd like to have us discuss. So if you go to the community forum, if you're not part of it already, join the VUG Canada group, and feel free to just post in there any ideas, any questions. We check that out quite regularly, and yeah, so we hope to have at least one, maybe 2 in-person sessions in the new year. Hopefully one in the east side of Canada and one maybe in the west side. So you can either visit myself or you can visit Tyler. And
or
so
both.
now, or both of us, yes. Yeah. So that's kind of the end of the presentation. If there are any questions, let's open the floor.